The US and China are embroiled in a high-tech fight for dominance. But this war isn't fought with weapons. It's fought with trade, technology, and data. Semiconductors are the new front line. The US has introduced new laws to bolster its domestic industry. But is the legislation also a thinly veiled attempt at capping China's rise? I'm Melinda Nusofora, and today's newsmaker is the chip wars. Semiconductors, or chips, are the foundation of modern life. In fact, they're so important that America is in a full-scale chip war. During the pandemic, chips became harder to find. A spike in sales and supply chain issues led to product delays for consumers, and that exposed a real problem for America. The US realised it's not making anywhere near enough chips to maintain its global dominance. American firms are still leaders in designing the technology, but the Netherlands produces most of the critical machinery needed to make the chips, while Taiwan, South Korea, and increasingly China churn them out. If you're at all unsure how this affects you, take a look at what chips are used for.
Microchips are the basic building blocks of modern technology. They're the tiny electronic switches on a small flat piece of silicon that run all computations. The first silicon transistor was built in the US in 1947. And they're at the heart of devices we use to live, work, and travel. Like the smartphones in your pocket, cars, TVs, wind turbines, robots, the data centers powering the internet, and even military equipment. This year, the microchip industry is expected to reach $600 billion, and by delivering new functions and better performance, all at a lower cost, each new generation of microchip is transforming industry and the way we live our lives.
On August 9th, US President Joe Biden signed the so-called CHIPS and Science Act into law. The legislation is designed to bolster the US domestic chip manufacturing industry. It allocates over $54 billion worth of subsidies to build more chip plants in the US and to support local research and development. It also provides a 25% tax credit for building and equipping US chip plants. In short, the CHIP Act is a pathway for the US to become more self-sufficient and less reliant on overseas semiconductor development. The big incentives have some of the world's largest companies biting. Intel is one of them.
You know, the CHIPS Act, the way it's designed, it's up to $3 billion per project. Obviously, we have 2 projects here. You know, and you sort of say, well, why is that? And, you know, all the studies have shown that if we were building in Asia, you know, and remember that, you know, the US and Europe used to be 80% of manufacturing. Today we're 20%. And this became acutely seen throughout COVID. It's like, why did we let something so important? Every aspect of your life is becoming digital. Everything digital, so semiconductors, and now we've become acutely dependent on a few areas of the world, and some of those not the most geopolitically stable, so let's build them back here. But if there's a 30 to 40% gap in the cost of building it there, what we build here must be competitive in the world. And that's the nature of the CHIPS Act. It's about closing that competitive gap.
So on the domestic front, major development is underway. But that's just part of the US strategy. On October 7th, the Biden administration unveiled sweeping measures aimed at limiting China's ability to import advanced chips, including the sophisticated ones used in military technologies. It also cut off China's access to the equipment it would need to manufacture its own. The Biden administration took the action unilaterally, but is pressuring its allies to fall in behind it. However, some countries are reluctant. The Netherlands is a major chip maker, and the Dutch trade minister has said his country won't blindly follow the US. The Netherlands and Japan share many of the US's security concerns, but the two countries also see China as a major market they don't want to lose. Washington has also imposed unprecedented restrictions on US citizens and residents who work for Chinese semiconductor companies. And this could strike at the heart of the Chinese chip industry. Since the early 2000s, China's semiconductor firms have relied heavily on foreign talent. Under the US export controls, American citizens, green card holders and residents would require a government license if they want to work for China's semiconductor companies. And while most analysts say this move is a major setback for China's chip sector, Anne Hoker, a partner at Bain & Co., says it won't stop China in the long run.
There is one thing China has been very consistent about. They need to build up an indigenous source of semiconductors. They will continue to put a lot of money in it, and they will continue to progress.
Well, is this a new style of Cold War? Joining me now to break it all down from Washington, D.C. is Riley Walters. He's a Deputy Director at the Japan Chair Hudson Institute and a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute. We have Shirley Ze Yu in New York, a political economist and professor focused on China's modern economy and techno-geopolitics. Completing our panel is Monique Chu from Southampton, a Chinese politics lecturer at the University of Southampton and author of the book The East Asian Computer Chip War. Thank you all so much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Riley, kick us off, because there will be some people out there who perhaps aren't that into tech who could be forgiven for thinking that this really just doesn't affect them. Why are they wrong?
Well, I would say, there has been a lot of new developments in this tech space, but it's really been limited to a lot of more of the leading edge technology, the stuff that you might not necessarily find in your car or other electronics that you might have around your house. And so, we're seeing these new restrictions unfolding, but it's not new. There is a lot of precedent here. Since the Cold War, if you will, there have been export controls on various technologies that the United States and other countries have agreed to implement. And I just see this as another phase of this. There is more restrictions, I guess, on some technologies, and some of it I think is warranted. But for the household consumer, it's not really going to have a big impact on what they consume. You'll still get your phones next year. You'll still get the newest computers or video games, that your children might want to buy. And so it's not really going to have a lasting impact, I would say, in the immediate sense, as far as we can see the developments as they're unfolding right now.
So you kind of pointed there towards how important this is, perhaps in that higher scale of technology. So we're talking military, national defense. Shirley, I want to ask you, is the US's new policies really about protecting its national security and its military, or is this really about money?
Hi, Melina. The national security concept has been significantly broadened in recent years in the United States. Trade, technology, climate, public health are all part of US's national security concept now. So very few people, I think, would agree that economic autarky is a good concept. From the Trump to the Biden administrations, the U.S. government has condemned China's use of industrial policies to develop its cutting-edge technology. But today, the U.S. is launching its very own industrial policies, not only in the crucial technology semiconductor sectors, but also in the crucial NEV industry. So if the U.S. doesn't think that China should use industrial policy as a good economic practice, why would the U.S. use it? And similarly, tariffs are not good for economic growth. Trade today is also a part of U.S.'s national security. And so there's little chance that I think the U.S. would actually remove the tariffs on goods from China. So today, it's really not about exclusively money or economic growth. It is really about national security.
What do you think, Monique? How much of this is really about protecting and enhancing the US domestic industry, and how much of it is about crippling and limiting China's?
It's about both. The recent CHIPS Act in the US is really designed to improve the American industrial competitiveness, but also to bring back a certain degree of manufacturing capability to the American soil. And on the other hand, the Chinese concern based on national security considerations is a very valid one. And this is because the dual-use nature of semiconductors. And this is also because of China's intensifying use of the civil-military fusion strategy to try to absorb civilian civilian semiconductor technologies for its own military end uses. So the answer is it's really both.
Riley, you kind of pointed to this in your first answer, but I want to drill down on it a little bit more. You mentioned the Cold War, and some people are saying that the restricting of commercial trade in military-relevant technologies is so reminiscent of the Cold War. What do you think? Is this a new Cold War, or is it an extension of what we used to have already been seeing?
I think a lot of people have been trying to make this point about whether there's a new Cold War between the United States and China for quite a while now. I'd say maybe almost 8 years, just right before the Trump administration came in. I wouldn't necessarily put it in those terms. I mean, especially when we're talking about these types of trade restrictions. As I said before, they've been around for almost nearly 30 years now, and they come in various degrees. Some are unilateral, which perhaps the United States alone might implement. Some are multilateral. We do have agreements with many countries at an international level that restrict the import or export of military and weapons of mass destruction level technology. And so, as Monique pointed out, there is this military civil fusion that's going on right now in China, where the Chinese government is trying to utilize their private companies to expand their domestic military capabilities. And I think both the Trump and the Biden administration are concerned about that. And what they're trying to do is, of course, in a very, I think, reasonable way, limit the type of exposure or the type of assistance that American companies might be providing to those efforts. And so the restrictions that we've seen up till now, again, are very limited. It is more focused on the high-end semiconductor side, the chips that go into supercomputers or weapons of mass destruction. And so it's not really limited. It's not really expanded to all of technology. But to say that there's a new Cold War, I don't think we're there just yet, because we do still do billions of dollars of trade with China every year on all sorts of goods, including a lot of it technology.
Shirley, Riley described it as a reasonable response to these sorts of concerns. Do you agree? And what's stopping China from just ramping up its own development of these very sophisticated chips and competing with the US?
Well, Riley's very convincing, but I happen to have a slightly different view. I think we are in the second Cold War. Unlike the previous Cold War, which overwhelmingly centered on military competition, this Cold War was centered on technology and global trade. I don't think war is going to be the central nexus for defining the current US-China Cold War. But also, interestingly, we're on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. So it is possible that even the world's most advanced chip companies or chip machines monopolized by ASML, for example, can become obsolete one day with the onset of new generations of disruptive technologies. And so if China could happen to master the new generation of technology by luck, then the whole global game strategy would have to be rewritten. So when global order is being fractured, compounded by the major disruptive technologies on the horizon, I think this is a super exciting and highly uncertain period of time.
And we can't really talk about uncertainty surrounding China without talking about Taiwan. So, Monique, to you, Taiwan is such a powerful hub for chip manufacturing. What impact does that have perhaps on China's interaction with Taiwan? Will it make them rethink perhaps their aggressive actions?
That's a very, very important question. Recently, some Chinese scholars have argued that there is an urgent need for China to take over Taiwan militarily in order to control Taiwan's advanced semiconductor firms. The fact of the matter is Chinese firms have also relied on supplies of semiconductor technologies and talents from Taiwan. So if we assume that the Chinese leader remains rational, then they need to think twice about any military attack against Taiwan, which may be, detrimental to the supplies of semiconductors to China, hence to China's own interests. So this certainly has complicated the relations between China and Taiwan. I have to, however, emphasize one thing. National security importance of the semiconductor industry cannot be overstated. And there has been a track record of the Chinese access to American and Taiwanese semiconductor technology to advance its military modernization. A recent example is China's tests of hypersonic missiles, which have relied on supercomputers equipped with semiconductors designed by a Chinese firm, which has access to American and Chinese semiconductor technology. So the real story about semiconductors is really complicated. It is not just about economic competition. There is a very strong national security dimension to the whole story. And this has been there for a long time. It is just that the issue has just been emerged or re-emerged over the past 2 years.
And Shirley, what do you think? Do you think that the US reliance on Taiwan for production has informed the US's foreign policy towards Taiwan?
It's really interesting because just talking about some enduring issues, actually the Taiwan unification issue has been an enduring issue from Beijing's perspective as well. As a matter of fact, ever since 1949. So some senior TSMC executives have been instrumental in speeding up China's semiconductor development process. As a result of their contributions, China's SMIC is today able to produce 7-nanometer chips, essentially on par with the technology capacity that Intel has. And so, but back to the Taiwan issue, you cannot really imagine that China would invade a territory just to seize its manufacturing capacity. The talents would be the first to leave. So without the talents, there would be no TSMC, there would be no semiconductors industry. Remember when Hitler started World War II, he drove the most promising talents from the European zone to the United States. And so it would be naive and I think overly simplistic to think that China would invade Taiwan because of TSMC. But with that said, China has not ruled out the possibility of using any means, including military means, to unify with Taiwan. And so that's been an enduring strategy for China. But that's for reasons other than semiconductors.
Riley, we're talking talent flow here. The US is trying to restrict the recruitment of Americans by Chinese firms. That seems quite surprising. Is that going to be effective? Because there's a huge expat community being educated in the US, and there's nothing stopping them from flowing towards Chinese companies.
Well, we were talking about export controls earlier, and the way that export controls work is they're not limited to just technology. It's limited to, it actually expands to information as well. And so if you're a PhD STEM major, if you're a semiconductor engineer, export controls actually apply to U.S. citizens as well. So there is authority there. And the United States isn't the only one worried about Chinese acquiring their talent. The Taiwanese, of course, have also implemented similar rules in other countries as well. because they're worried about their technology falling into Chinese hands. And so the talent sign is actually, it's a whole nother topic, which I find very interesting, because the United States actually has a talent shortage right now, especially in the semiconductor space. And so I think one of the efforts that the Biden administration has been trying through its legislation is not just investing in the domestic manufacturing capabilities or the domestic research and development, but the domestic training as well. And one of those efforts includes, I think, encouraging more foreign talent into the United States to help with either the manufacturing or research and development. And we're working with our friends in Taiwan. We're working with our friends in Japan and Europe to sort of make sure that we can all collaborate and not necessarily over compete with each other in these fields. But it is an interesting space.
Shirley, China hasn't outwardly retaliated yet. How do you expect them to react to these new export restrictions?
Very interestingly, after the CHIP Act was announced, China did not resort to wolf warrior diplomacy. China has responded not with words, but rather actions. I think the talent war is for real. The global talent recruitment campaign by China will double down. And today we're seeing Chinese leading tech companies such as Huawei are offering 5 times the global prevailing salaries to recruit global top chip talents. And so that's something by law the US companies cannot do. So China certainly today doesn't have a talent advantage, but it has a talent policy advantage. And I think China will continue to use that to drive up its competitive talent edge. And remember, global talents are free agents, rational human beings. And as Riley correctly pointed out, over 30% of the STEM major graduates with a master's degree or above in the United States today are from the developing world. They are from countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Vietnam, Iran, China, and the rest. And so to a lot of these talents, they are really not entangled with this US-China strategic competition. They are not a stakeholder in it. And so to them, it's about maximizing career opportunities, maximizing human civilization advancement, and pushing the global tech frontier. So to them, wherever there is opportunities, they are going to go for it. And I think China also will continue to use a whole of government approach to address the chip bottlenecks. And today, which is understood that Tencent and Alibaba are also recruited in China's whole of government approach to drive chip advancement. And also, if I may say, that China is also using a sort of a different strategy from the United States in tackling the global chip war. China is using a lot of mature technologies in semiconductors, the 14 nanometers and the 28 nanometers to empower AI ubiquity in the country. And so now, rather than going after the Moore's law to drive the best chips development, China is commercializing AI ubiquity to drive technology development in another dimension.
Monique, if I could ask you, the US relies on China for things like rare earth minerals that are required to manufacture electronics. Could we see China banning the US from buying those? Are we going to see a tit-for-tat banning with regards to pharmaceuticals? Or do you think this is going to be isolated to this chip sector?
It's really hard to say. And of course, issue linkage is a potential strategy that any country can use in facing this intensifying export control measures regarding semiconductors against that country in question. And so, but at the same time, it is a fact that China will continue to face an uphill battle in increasing and improving its semiconductor capability at home. I have started to, really explore this issue area over the past 15 years. And my research has told me that China continues to face internal and external challenges in its attempt to try to really improve its semiconductor capability. These challenges include, for example, export controls that we have discussed already, but they also include China's own shortage of talents, as well as investment in R&D endeavors. At the same time, the Chinese local firms are not going to catch up with the global giants anytime soon in the EDA tools section, as well as the advanced semiconductor manufacturing subsector. So I think in years to come, we're going to see continuous fight in this semiconductor arena, for sure.
Absolutely. It is such a complex issue, and I wish we had more time to delve into it deeper with all three of you, because your input has been so valuable. It's one of these topics that I think many people could be surprised at just how far-reaching these chips are, and that it really is, as you have all pointed out, it's the new Cold War frontier. We appreciate your expertise. Thank you for your time on the Newsmakers. And thank you to our audience. Thanks for watching this week. Of course, you can follow us on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Melinda Nusafora. We'll see you next time.